Welcome to another edition of The Need for Courage. I'm your host, John Byrne, and with me today is Mary Triggiano. Mary is the director for the Andrews Center for Restorative Justice here at Marquette University Law School, former chief judge of the Milwaukee Circuit Court, and a long history of working in various community-related topics that we're going to touch on today, in part because of the connection it has to peacemaking. So, Mary, thank you for taking the time today. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you for having me. And I'd like to also thank the Center for Peacemaking and Pat Kennelly for inviting me here today.
So one of the things, I did an interview earlier with Gabe Velez about restorative justice. And so I have a general feeling of the definition. But for our audience, we'll talk about the center, we'll talk about the work and what got you there from a career path standpoint. But how would you define restorative justice?
That's a great question. I often tell my students when I'm teaching restorative justice is a unique and deeply human approach to harm that centers the voices of those who've been harmed, brings people together. I think the best way I often teach it, especially to law students, is to compare it to the traditional system of justice, where that system asks a couple questions. What law was broken? Who broke it, and how do we punish? It goes a little beyond that in some settings, but that's by and large what we look at in the traditional systems like criminal and juvenile justice. Restorative justice changes the question. It changes the conversation. In many ways, it shifts it to who's been harmed, and in doing so, we center the voices of those who often have been sidelined in the other justice systems. Victims, people who've been harmed. And through storytelling, we then start to understand the depth of that harm. We also then ask, what are their needs and whose obligation is it to move towards harm repair and often then potentially healing? So it's a more humanistic definition and way of looking at justice.
So harm repair both for the victims, but their extended families and even communities, right? That's part of the goal?
Absolutely. And in fact, right, the opening up and the bringing together of people to look at the harm and move towards harm repair is really an important piece of restorative justice. The traditional system has people separated. Restorative justice is a bringing together where everyone has to participate in looking at the harm and harm repair. And we often talk about it as the ripple effect of harm, right? We don't do that in the justice system, but in restorative justice, we're not only looking at the immediate harm, but all those harms that happen afterward, right? It's not like my house was robbed, but now my trust and my safety is compromised, and so are my neighbors. So the community is impacted by harm as well.
You had a long career in the justice system as a circuit court judge and many other things. One of the things we talked about to prepare for this conversation was some of the work you and colleagues did with the Green Bay correctional system, and as examples of what you called circles in conversation. Talk a bit about that, and maybe some examples that showed maybe not defined as success, but sort of improvement to the goals that you already mentioned.
That's a great question as well. So I can't talk about Green Bay Correctional without mentioning former Justice Janine Geske, who left the Wisconsin Supreme Court and found her path in establishing the Restorative Justice Initiative at the law school. And part of that path was working at Green Bay Correctional and bringing together in a restorative justice circle for a dialogue men who were incarcerated there, her students, and then community members. But among those community members were 3 persons who were impacted by significant violent harm. And then they would tell their story of harm to these men. And I was asked to join her shortly after I became a judge in 2004, so probably around 2007, was my first introduction to restorative justice through a circle at Green Bay. And what I noticed was that in that circle, we built this level of community that was beginning to understand the depth of everyone's woundedness, and were able then to come together to try to determine how each person would move towards some level of harm repair and healing in their own lives. What I learned in that circle really guided me as a judge in the circuit court when I was in children's court and domestic violence court and in other courts, and then ended up me directing the Andrews Center for Restorative Justice. So
before you went to and you've been at the center roughly 3 years, as a judge, how did it affect or change the sentencings? I know obviously a lot of sentencing is created by statute, and maybe there's not a ton of discretion, but when you started becoming more involved in restorative justice, how did that change the way you would sentence a case, if at all? Like, how did that work? Maybe a couple examples would be great.
Yeah, I think the main principles of restorative justice that I took with me into my practice on the bench was more deep listening, understanding the harm of every individual in my courtroom, but also an understanding of how to interact with people and how to look more towards harm repair and healing. So I didn't necessarily sentence any differently. I just treated people more with dignity and respect to try to find an avenue where people could be made more whole, where harm repair could be done, where healing could begin. As a judge, especially at children's court, where I spent 9 of my 20 years, the district attorney's office was using restorative justice there in their early intervention programs. And so as a judge, I could refer some of the youth that were in front of me to those projects and programs where I knew as a tool, amongst other tools, they may be able to reduce recidivism, help victims understand and heal from the harm that these youth had caused them.
Recidivism is an important issue. As I mentioned, I interviewed Gabe a bit ago, the book that he put together, and it seemed very logical to those of us that aren't enmeshed in this space that if you can deal with the perpetrators of these various crimes and get them somehow back into society, then there's a value proposition because they're not going to continue along committing other crimes. Given the environment that we're in, and certainly the environment we were in the 90s when they were passing all these crime bills, a lot of policymakers said, we just need to punish people. There needs to be accountability. So you've already talked a bit about how this deals with improving societal issues. But how do you respond to people that say that? And maybe the other example would be, you talked about the victims. I thought that's fascinating because I would suspect that there's some victims that feel, hey, I was robbed or I was attacked. I want that person punished. But it sounds like from the examples that you've used that when you have these broader conversations, they think differently. So I guess 2 points. How do you respond to those that say we want accountability? And then secondly, maybe some of the examples that you've already begun to talk about.
So I think we talked about people thinking that this is sort of soft on crime or harm. And what I would say, it's really not soft on harm. And I use the word harm because restorative justice can be used in a variety of settings, not just where criminal conduct is evident. But it's not soft on harm. It's really laser focused on it. And it really asks individuals who have committed harm to do a lot more. And you and I talked yesterday about the fact that in the criminal justice system, everyone is separate. A defendant goes in front of the judge, has to make statements to the judge. Maybe they add something about the victim. Sometimes victims don't even show up. But to actually have to come face to face with the person that you harmed and sit in the room across from them and have a dialogue and also agree to take accountability for the harm you committed and be part of harm repair is something that's completely different than the traditional systems that we operate in. And it's not for everybody. And we're never there to fix something, but we're let people come together to have the dialogue. And what I found at least at children's court most often is that people who've been harmed actually want to sit in front of the person who's harmed them and ask the questions that don't get answered in the traditional system of justice. That in and of itself, naming the harm, having the person who's harmed them understand it, is the first step to opening the doorway to healing.
Their interest in talking to the perpetrator, sort of a why me? Why did you single our family out? Those kind of crimes which are committed kind of randomly, I guess. Is that part of, I don't want to say the healing process, but that's part of what victims want to know besides why you did it? Why was I selected?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. That's probably one of the main questions. I recently did a restorative justice dialogue in a very complex case where a young teenager died. And there were 2 goals. The first goal of the family who faced these individuals was, I want to humanize my son. I want you to know about this individual beyond the incident that happened, that he was an athlete, he was a son, a brother, a community member, an athlete who wanted to teach younger kids. That then engenders in the person who's committed the harm or harmed somebody this understanding of what their complicitness in it, and it really gets them to think deeper about what they did and show I think, more authentic remorse and understanding of the situation.
You've been the director for 3 years. Walk us through your career path. You said you were a judge in 2004. You obviously picked up additional interest in restorative justice, and you saw this opportunity. Talk about how that's working at Marquette. And then I know you do some campus-wide meetings with other centers like the Center for Peacemaking. So talk about how that works together.
Sure. And remind me of all those questions if I don't answer them. That's right. So I became a judge in 2004, signed a children's court, really learned early on the philosophy and the framework for restorative practices. And so I really tried to adopt those. I also, in that time frame, learned a lot about the impact of stress and trauma on the populations that we see coming into court. And so throughout my career I was in the children's court, domestic violence specialty court, back to children's court, the civil division, then I became the chief judge right when the pandemic hit, by the way. Those things really framed my understanding and how I wanted to view my work in the courts from a more humane standpoint. And then before COVID hit, I started teaching about the impact of trauma and problem-solving courts at Marquette Law School as an adjunct with a clinician. So it was like a collaboration. And I found out that I really love teaching law students. They're so excited about learning and trying to take that with them into their practice. COVID hit, I had to stop teaching, and I really, really missed it. And so when the Restorative Justice Initiative was supported by Justice Geske and Sue and Louis Andrew, who are graduates. Louis graduated from the law school in 1966 and Sue from undergrad in 1966, decided they were going to endow the Restorative Justice Initiative, and it became the Andrew Center for Restorative Justice. Justice Geske told me about it. I applied, and long story short, I was offered the job, and I was like, okay, I'm the chief judge, still trying to recover from the pandemic, but I really missed teaching, and I really loved restorative justice, and I made that step, and it was a very positive one, and I really enjoy what I'm doing teaching. So I teach each semester a restorative justice workshop to 2 and 3L law students, and I also teach a clinic with Professor Becca Donaldson, who's the assistant clinical professor with me, and that takes us into community. And what I mean by that is we work in the community corrections campus and the courts, the 4 C's as I call them. We collaborate with other individuals, and we go and we do these circle dialogues in different settings. We have a project with Sojourner Family Peace Center. We have a project with, we're starting a project at Children's Court. We go into Racine Correctional like Justice Geske went into Green Bay Correctional. So I'm recreating the great work she did at Green Bay in Racine with my students and storytellers and the men. And we're trying to engender, harm repair and healing as we move through these clinical programs. And the students are fabulous. And I think they learn a lot about looking at justice from a different lens.
And you're connecting with other parts of the university as well, as we mentioned, the Center for Peacemaking. We talked yesterday, I think you said it doesn't always work that way. We try to have quarterly meetings throughout. How many different parts of Marquette are connected in some fashion to what you are doing with restorative justice?
So restorative justice is a really important topic on campus at the Center for Peacemaking and in other settings, to the point where there are a lot of wonderful people trying to bring restorative practices to the campus, but also to the community. And so when you put all these brilliant minds together in one place and we share information and we cross-pollinate and we work together, it can be really powerful. So you mentioned Gabe Velez. So he comes to our restorative justice campus meeting, as I call it, and he had been working with another professor, Louise Kenker, and the Center for Peacemaking to actually do a training on campus for those who might be interested in actually becoming restorative justice facilitators. And that's still an ongoing project. Center for Peacemaking has a lot of work going on in community, public school settings, community centers to combine their peacemaking work with restorative justice practices. And so we all share that information and try to help support each other in whatever way we can. And it's really powerful.
We talked earlier about the classes you teach here, and you referred to a paper that a student of yours just completed. Why don't you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so the Restorative Justice Workshop, the students actually have to team up and conduct their own restorative justice healing or community building circle. And many of them do it either on campus or amongst the law school. 2 students decided that they were going to bring women litigators in the community together to talk about some of the challenges they face as being a woman in this profession and being a litigator in this profession. They have to do the circle, present it to the class in a PowerPoint presentation, and then separately have to reflect on and write about it. And one student said this in her paper, and I thought it was important to read because she was opining about the Restorative Justice Workshop class and what it meant to her. And she said, "This class has also made me aware of the kind of lawyer I want to be. I want to be someone who listens, who takes the time to understand, and who recognizes that sometimes the most important part of a situation is not always what is written in the law, but what is experienced by the people involved. More than anything, this class brought me back to the why of why I chose law school in the first place. Somewhere along the way, I lost that. I got caught up in grades, internships, and just trying to make it through. I stopped thinking about the bigger picture and started focusing on the next assignment, the next deadline, the next thing I needed to do. And in that process, I think I lost a sense of purpose. This class gave that back to me." And she goes on to talk about the principles and practices of restorative justice and how she sees them and how she believes she can take those and become a better lawyer. And as I always say, it's also made me a better human being, right? It makes us better human beings to understand the other and come together instead of being so divided and separate.
When you and I chatted yesterday, I asked you, your class is selected by the students, so they actually want to be part of this. But I said, do you ever had any experience where somebody that was in the class that was sort of skeptical was turned around? And you gave a really good example of that. One of your students.
Yeah. I think there are students that come to it curious, but not really understanding the restorative justice and what they're ostensibly going to learn. And I had a student who joined us in the restorative justice circle in Racine Correctional and listened to people respond to a prompt. And the prompt was share a story or describe a time when you were impacted by violence. That's a prompt everyone can answer, especially these days, whether it's directly impacts you or a friend or you've seen it on the news, right? And he listened for a long period of time, and I saw that he was in deep thought. And when the talking piece came to him in the circle, he said, "I was harmed as a child. It impacted me to the point where I wanted to harm others. I wanted to go out into community, and I became a bouncer so that I could take my frustration out on somebody or something." And he said, most of the men there who are African American, right, were imprisoned where he wasn't, and he was Caucasian. And he said, "I don't know, right, that why you're here and I'm not. I have some ideas," but he said, "I need to share this because, right, I ultimately could have been in your place from harming people." But he also understood about healing and how to move forward. And this class opened up his eyes, and I think they use the word transformation. I usually try not to, but he felt in a way that doing restorative justice was transformative for him and that he could then go out and be a better person and a better lawyer, just experiencing that.
That's great. I do want to get you to talk a bit about the film that you mentioned, Mending Our Wounds, from 2024. Talk a bit about that and where people might be able to access that.
Sure. So the Andrews Center has decided we teach, practice, and advance restorative justice, but we want to tackle some really significant harms that are going on in our communities. So we have been really laser focused on gun violence, domestic violence, hence our project with Sojourner Family Peace Center, traffic violence, reckless driving, and other violent kinds of issues. But we also recognize there's some really important things going on in our community that need to be shared with other people. And so in 2024, our Restorative Justice Conference was about gun violence prevention. And it was entitled The Intersection of Restorative Justice, Healthcare, and Street Outreach as a Healing Approach to Gun Violence Prevention. And we were trying to uplift the work that's being done at the Medical College of Wisconsin, its Comprehensive Injury Center, its Trauma Quality of Life program, and the 414 Violence Interrupters, which brings people with lived experience into community to try to bring down the temperature in communities to reduce revenge and retaliation around gun violence. And I decided that, and I don't often do this, but I wanted to do a restorative justice circle, film it, and then share it with the conference folks. And so what I did was I brought together 2 414 violence interrupters, a trauma surgeon, 2 nurse practitioners from the Trauma Quality of Life program, a youth, a 24-year-old who was a circle keeper in Milwaukee Public Schools, and 2 individuals who had been shot or had witnessed people getting shot in their communities, and then 1 person from the Milwaukee Fire Department as a first responder. And the goal was for them to name the harms that they've experienced, right? The trauma surgeon seeing people come in over and over and over and trying to patch them up. The firefighter who sees people as the first response and seeing people's bodies torn apart. Someone who's been shot telling the story from start to finish about how they were shot and the impact it had on them, that ripple effect that we've been talking about. And so we named the harm, and then we moved to hope. What do you see as hope in our communities? And they started to talk about the violence interruption going on, the people who really care deeply about changing and shifting relationships so that violence doesn't have a place to grow. And so it was very powerful. It's on our website. I think it's the Andrews Center for Restorative Justice. If you Google that and then you look at videos, it's a 52-minute video of a circle that I facilitated. It doesn't give you all the flavors of it, but because we had to cut some stuff out of it. And then in that conference, we worked with Center for Peacemaking, who helped steer us towards a keynote speaker. Pat Kennelly knew somebody out of Illinois, and so we brought that person in. So there's some collaboration going on in that sense as well.
So folks can go to the website, obviously, and look at it there. I really appreciate your time. I'll get you out of here on this last one.
Sure.
Given everything that we've talked about, given everything that you've done in your career, but also given the chaos of this world in 2026, are you optimistic that restorative justice can be a more broader focal point for people that perhaps are unaware of?
Absolutely. I don't think I'd be doing this work if I thought it wasn't going to be meaningful in some regard, but I think we talk about hope, and I see it every day in my students who are learning about restorative justice and are able to implement it in some way, somehow in their lives, especially as leaders in our community as they become lawyers. I think they are in a position to start shifting lives and impacting them to such a degree that maybe we will have more peaceful communities because they are laser focused on that as well. I also see it in our communities. I see it in the work going on here on campus with those individuals who come to our meetings and talk about, we all need to really focus on doing this good work. So I have hope because I can see it every day.
Mary, thank you so much. For more information, go to the website. Also for the Center for Peacemaking's website, they have a newsletter that you can sign up for, so please do that as well. Thank you, Mary. Appreciate your time.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.